Hi all, this is my Psych 199 portfolio summary reflection, and this will be talking about all I've learned in Psychology 199, this module, and also the real life applications and me reflecting upon what can be used in real life situations through what I've learned in this module. So in Psychology 199, basically we have learned all these topics, or basically a sub of the topic. Basically, we started off with intro to psychology as well as research methods. We later proceeded to things like learning and also lifespan development and intelligence. We later streamed out to attachment styles as well as learning about the different types of psychoanalysis and psychoanalysts who have been practicing psychoanalysis in psychology. And later we moved on to social psychology, all different forms of psychology. So throughout this whole module, I've been able to learn topics that have been easily applied in real life. So take for example research methods. In research methods we learned about the different kinds of ways you could conduct research. For example, you could conduct surveys, or you could do correlation studies if you wanted to test something. And this applies more than just in psychology. It applies to communication research, which is also something I major in, communications. And it's actually very interesting because I can use the techniques that I've learned in psychology to actually conduct research, and also broaden my understanding of something, or if I want to find out something or test a hypothesis about something. We later moved on to things like intelligence. So we learned when I was younger, people used to talk about intelligence in terms of IQ and EQ and whatever, but we weren't really sure how to define intelligence. And in psychology, we realized that intelligence can be defined in many ways. One of which was more famously used examples were using IQ tests, and we learned about the SB test and Simon Binet tests. But we realized that, or at least I realized that in this module, I found out that actually IQ tests aren't really the best way to test someone's intelligence, because it was actually designed for the French, and it doesn't fully test someone's intelligence. Rather, they are just basing it on certain skills of a person, and not everyone has the same skills or possesses the same cognitive developments. So you'll be wrong to judge a person based on just quantitative reasoning or working memory or visual spatial processing or fluid reasoning. Some people are just better at other things, and if you're just gonna base something on a test, well, it's not really an accurate way of testing someone. Later we learned things like the Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligence, and I think that was more relatable. In terms of learning, we were able to learn things like, if a person had linguistic ability, what would they likely be doing, maybe in the field of a writer or comedian. Or if they had better skills such as musical abilities, they will most likely be musicians. Intrapersonal or interpersonal abilities, they'll most likely be a poet, actor, a church minister, or it could even be a journalist, or interpersonal, or even a politician. And it was things like that that I felt were very relevant, because it also allowed us to understand better why people were in certain fields or why people had certain jobs. Moving on, we learned attachment styles, and I think this was one of the more interesting topics in Psych 199, because partly we see children nowadays with very different attachment styles, and you see parents who are constantly worried that their child will be crying, or you'll see certain children crying and you don't understand why they are crying. Well, apparently there are many different kinds of attachment styles, and some parents brought up their children in different ways, or the lack of contact with their children caused them to have some kind of anxious attachment style or ambivalent attachment style. And we realized that through learning this topic, and I think the biggest takeaway I can have from this topic is, in the future when I do have kids, or if I have friends or relatives who have kids, I can tell them how to make sure that their children will be better behaved, or will have or how to maintain a better relationship with their child, because attachment style is very important. It leads to how a child may behave when they are in their youth, and eventually it will move on to how they will actually behave when they are young adults or even adults, through how they were brought up. And of course it's also a culturally specific, and it depends on which culture we are in. And given Singapore's culture, we are not so much the kinds that let our children free, so attachment style is something very important. We learn about the different kinds of psychoanalysts, and particularly Sigmund Freud. Freud's theory of psychosexual stages was something very unique to me personally. I felt that I learned a lot in his analysis of how children, or basically how there were different stages children had to go through in order to not have certain behaviors. And I realized some people could have been stuck at certain stages in their life, psychosexual stages, causing them to behave how they behave now. So for example, if I know a friend who is a smoker, I would say, oh, maybe he's stuck in the oral stage. And then I've met people who have done group work with, and they're extremely anal about things, and they are stuck in the so-called anal stage, where they're very specific about things. They are very fearful that people make mistakes. They really want things to be their way because of certain ways they were brought up. They were not allowed to indulge so much when they were learning how to potty train, or they were not allowed to suck on their fingers when they were young. So there's always an oral or anal kind of distress in them. And I think this was one of the topics that, although slightly controversial, Sigmund Freud, but he taught us many things about how people would eventually behave, despite him not actually personally interviewing such people. He was just taking anecdotes of people. Moving on, we learn learning, and people say like, why are we learning about learning? But ironically, in learning there was a lot to learn, and chief among which were the different types of conditioning. There were classical conditioning and operant conditioning. And in learning, we learned that classical conditioning is something we have been dealing with, or have already personally dealt with, in terms of fears. So we are normally conditioned to fear something. For example, if we are conditioned to fear a cockroach, because of somewhat classical conditioning or second-hand conditioning, where someone fears a cockroach, maybe our parents, and then we are taught to learn about such fears. Or we could have already been trained, for example, in terms of imagine a situation where you are caught in the thunderstorm and there's lightning, and you learn that, oh, when there's lightning you have to take out you have to go to a safe place rather, and if it's raining you have to take out your umbrella, sort of things. And we also learned about operant conditioning, where you are learning by consequence, and you also have schedules of reinforcement and punishment to ensure that someone learns, and the person can actually ensure that that learning will always stay with him, because because of the operant reinforcement, such as fixed scheduled reinforcement or fixed ratio reinforcement, stuff like that, that we managed to learn through this module. Moving on, we also covered things like lifespan development, and this was more towards also something to do with behaviors in adults, and it talked mostly about Jean Piaget's theory as well as Erik Erikson's theory, and how children had different stages in their lives. And for Jean Piaget, he believed that people had certain stages where they acquired certain skills, and while Erik Erikson focused mostly on crisis development and how people encountered certain crises during certain stages of their lives, this topic taught me how important development in our lives, throughout our lives, is crucial towards our behavior and towards how we believe certain things or how we feel. And personally, I could link back lifespan development in my own life, because I've gone through certain stages where maybe in the trust-mistrust stage, in what Erik Erikson used to talk about, whether your parents allow you to learn things by yourself, or they are guarding you. Things like that were applicable, because I could see myself not being able to trust certain people, and maybe that was something to do with my own lifespan development. And I feel that this was one of the biggest takeaways from this module. I was able to apply all these things that I've learned into my real life and adapt to it. And moving on to application, you can definitely apply stress, or rather the moderators of stress in this sense. Stress was a topic that we thought, why are we learning this? But apparently there's so much more to stress than just the word stress, and stress actually involves having resources or the lack of resources. And in Psych 199, unlike our other psychology module, it focused mostly on how do we moderate the stress, how do we find the resources, how do we come up with a stress plan, or rather a plan to moderate the stress in terms of time management, in terms of setting up a planner, in terms of setting up a goal to reach a task, and what to do when we are stressed, what can we expect to believe, what can we expect to find when we are in a stressful situation. And out of the syllabus, I think not really covered in the syllabus was our professor's view on why we were stressed, and it resonated a lot with us because most of us were stressful because it was the pressures of our own beliefs, or maybe pressures from parents, and we could relate to such things because we were experiencing, and we could actually apply directly how to moderate stress in terms of having a planner and having a schedule. Especially for me, I felt that having a planner was necessary, and having a schedule to moderate my stress by planning out what I wanted to do every day to study. So that was really interesting. And lastly, we went on to social psychology. Social psychology was particularly interesting because we managed to learn things as to why people were facing certain situations, especially in terms of times of need, why people refuse to help, or why did people help. For example, in an accident, why did people decide to help a stranger, or the reasons why people decide not to help a stranger. It was the most, among all the topics, I think one of the easiest to apply in the real life, real world, because it was happening around us. There were things like why people saw us, so why do people in uniform seem more obliged to help than a normal civilian, or if people were actually helping eyewitness, or like eyewitness testimony, why were people just not so sharp when it came to such issues such as finding an eyewitness. And social psychology really taught me a lot in terms of why people behave certain ways, and that is definitely one of the more important things in this module, to find out why people behave in a certain manner and what prompts them to behave in a certain manner, whether it was just pure ignorance or really they had a real reason for it. So to conclude, everything I learned in this module was applicable, and it was extremely interesting to find out more about psychology, and in terms of how I could apply all of these methods into the real world. And I can safely say I am very assured that I can use all of these topics in terms of application in my future modules as well as in the real world. So a big thank you to my professor, Dr. Goh Boon Yao. And yes, this concludes this video. Thank you.